Well, good morning everyone and welcome to this week's edition of the Farming Programme. This programme was recorded last Thursday evening when we were just beginning to experience the first few drops of much needed and much welcome rain. I know you'll all be saying farmers are never satisfied. I know we've enjoyed the good weather. It's been good for lambing and good to turn cattle out to, and lambs particularly. I think the lambing season, that's been an incredible season this year. Not only was it actually good for the shepherd lambing, it was good for the sheep as well. I think I mentioned last week our sheep usually lambed indoors, but this year we decided to lamb them outside in the good weather, and that really did pay off. The sheep were fitter, the lambs were more vigorous, they were straight out onto the grass, and the sun on their backs during these past few days has brought about an unbelievable development or rate of development in the lamb as he started to grow. So all in all, the fine weather was very, very welcome, but unfortunately, and probably for the north of the island particularly, it's gone on just a little bit too long. And I know home at Bullawillian, the sandy banks on the top side of the Peel Road have been burning now for, when I say burning, I mean the grass dying back, for the last week or more. Cows have been almost round their first run round of the grazing, and some rain now will indeed help to make that grass recover for the second bite, which is critical. But we hope the rain will continue a bit more. Sorry if it's going to inconvenience you wherever you are, but the ground, I can tell you, in your garden must be telling you now that it needs a drink, and most of the island does. And when it comes, it will freshen things up and we'll get back on schedule again. Well, this week I have two guests sharing the programme with me. One well-known contractor in the south of the island, particularly Keith Masson from Cricket, well known as he goes round the farms on his contracting rounds. Keith, and I should say that the other guest with me is Sayle, who Keith will tell us about later on, and we'll get our discussion going. But first of all, Keith, tell us about the contracting for this season. It should have suited you as a contractor to get round on the job, surely.
It has, John. It's been a tremendous, as you said, a spell of weather. It's aided tremendously with getting the crops in. At home we wouldn't really contemplate putting cereal crop in March, but we were all pretty well finished.
And did it take the pressure off a contract? Everybody wants the same job done on the same day, don't they, from a contractor's point of view?
Pretty well, yes, and especially if the weather's very catchy as last season. Everybody's on the phone wanting you at the same time, and if you're passing the gate, they may not have rang you, but they want you to see when you're going back the other way, can you fit them in, sort of thing, yeah.
What's been your busiest aspect? What do you specialise in anything particularly, Keith, or what's your busiest line?
Our busiest line is we mainly do harvest work, which is grass silage, maize silage, whole crop, and now this alkylage. And we also run the combine, so particularly any crop basically we can harvest like.
So you concentrate most on the conservation then, one way or another, and that leads us very nicely into the subject that we've got, because you've brought onto the island Sayle. Just tell us why he's here and what his subject is.
Well, it all started about 12 years ago when Alan, as he was then working for Dugdale's, came up with this system for conserving cereals in an alkaline form, which is slightly drier than the normal fermented whole crop. And there were several of us at the time that were interested in going down this route, and it coincided with the first self-propelled forager that we bought, and it was bought with this job in mind. And it worked well for about 2-3 years, and then because you're doing it at such a dry stage, you have to be very careful that it's not too dry, otherwise the grain passes through the cow's hole. And so subsequently it slipped back. It was always there, but it slipped back in how many people were doing it. And then about 2 years ago, I think it was, that ongoing research and development, actually come up with these processors now that you fit to the forager that will process it and break the grain, and now there's no limit to when you can actually harvest the crop.
So science and technology are leading us on into new eras all the time, Keith, and this is probably one of the latest developments, I suppose, in actually conserving forage maybe for cattle.
As in the processing side of it, yes, that is very recent. The actual conservation side, as I said, has been around about 12 years or so.
Well, let's turn to Alan now and get the technical and the scientific details of this. Alan Sayle, now that's a Manx name. You haven't got a Manx accent, but gosh, Sayle's a Manx name. Tell us a bit about your background.
It certainly is a Manx name, and I'm extremely proud of it. From what I can understand in my sort of family tree, our family farmed somewhere near Braddon in the sort of 1800s, and my grandfather, went over to England. I think he was classified as a bit of a black sheep of the family.
Really?
But he went over to England, and he met my grandmother then, and
you've decided that after 200 years it's safe to come back again, is that?
Just about. No, I thoroughly enjoy coming back. It's a wonderful place to come to, and it's a pleasure to be able to come back and bring something which may help the ability of the Manx farmer to sort of utilise his produce and his crops in a more efficient way.
Now, Keith has been telling us, that this has been around for about 12 years and had some ups and downs. I can remember when we went, I'm old enough to remember when we went from hay to silage. Mm-hmm. And one of the great attractions of that move was that silage was quite a simple process. You simply cut the grass, put it in a clamp, sealed it well, and took it out again. You eliminated the weather risk. It was straightforward, uncomplicated, and that was a great attraction. In this technical pursuit now and this development, are we missing that a bit? Are we getting a bit more complex now?
No, in actual fact, hopefully the whole process is being simplified. As Keith has already mentioned, the ability to process grain in a forage harvester means that it's a one-step operation. But just going backwards for a little while, you mentioned there about the change from hay to silage. What actually sort of the difference was when we made it into silage is that we used bacteria to produce acids which actually pickle the grass. But the cattle that we're feeding to are ruminants, and those ruminants want to actually use those products in their first instance. So we always accept that grazed grass is the best. Silage grass is second best. And as production levels have been required to go up with all the financial pressures and so forth, feeding more and more grass silage or cutting it earlier and so forth to make it more digestible actually sort of puts a great deal of pressure on the animal for structural fibre in that diet to maintain that sort of rumination. And as a consequence of the better genetics that have come through in sort of all animals, either dairy cows, beef and sheep, what we need to do is to support their potential, and that requires, in some cases, or did require, putting higher levels of concentrates in. The problem being was that those concentrates sometimes created a situation where the rumen, the sort of organ which actually sort of produces this quality sort of material that they can use, became over acid, and the performance levels sometimes didn't sort of match to where we want them to be, and we weren't getting the sort of same efficiency that we were required.
I think some of us who have been feeding silage for some time and feeding barley alongside silage as well, which many of us have recognised and realised the very acidic product we were feeding to our cattle. Mm-hmm. And we tried to sort of moderate that in all sorts of ways. And I imagine that this is where this development has come from.
Yes, well, for 30 years I was involved with a feed company in Lancashire, and I had the good opportunity to go out to the States in the 1980s and realise that they had one thing over there that they were feeding to their cattle. Perhaps they didn't realise it, but they had the access to lucerne hay. And lucerne hay, which is alkaline and sort of provides the structural fibre, allowed them to feed large amounts of maize grain, not maize silage, maize grain, without creating problems. And their production levels, let's say in sort of dairy cows, were running at towards 10,000 litres, where often we were at sort of 5. Now we've had to move forward to that level, and as a producer of concentrates at that time, that was my sort of responsibility. Those concentrates, the better we made them, sometimes we had a detrimental effect by trying to sort of improve the sort of nutrient intake. And so
the detrimental effect was inside the cow.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And as a result, I looked at sort of initially trying to sort of conserve grass in an alkaline form. But things developed, and we eventually got to sort of conserving cereals, because grass doesn't have any starch in it on its own. We need starch in the diet if we're going to meet the higher production levels. And so we developed this alkaline ammonia release system, which means that crops from a dry matter of anywhere from 60% upwards can be conserved very efficiently. But as Keith mentioned earlier, the one detriment to that was that your window to cut it was very narrow, because the grain would sometimes very quickly dry out and grains would pass through.
Just at this point, Alan, could we just go back for our non-farming listeners, and could we just go through the process before we get into too much technical data? Go through the process of a farmer deciding to adopt this method of feeding his cattle. Where does he begin? What does he start with?
Basically, he starts with a cereal crop. It could either be barley, wheat, triticale, or anything now, because the processor allows us to process barley, which perhaps previously we couldn't do. The grain skin was too hard, so we tended to use just wheat in the early stages.
So we start off with a cereal crop, sown and grown in the normal way that you would grow any cereal crop.
Yeah, in exactly the same way that you would grow a normal cereal crop.
Right, and let's go on to the next stage now.
At any stage beyond, say, 60 to 65% dry matter, a machine like Keith's can go into that field, cut it.
What would a person look over the hedge see at that stage?
He perhaps may mistake it for a combine.
Because it's in full ear, it's in full head.
Oh, without a doubt,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. I mean, we want the whole crop.
Yeah.
There are crops that are cut earlier when the crops are green. In some ways, I always think that it's a bit like sort of calving a cow at sort of 8 months rather than 9. We've taken all this trouble to grow the crop, and then we cut it before it's matured. So, no, we leave the crop until it's completely mature. And with the processes that are now involved, it doesn't matter if it goes even right up to combinable stage, because the ammonia preservative system will actually make sure that that crop, plus all the grain that's cracked and so forth, will actually be fully utilised by the animal. And the ammonia addition to it is utilised as a protein source by the animal itself. So we're actually able now to sort of produce a concentrate which could be the whole food for the animal, and certainly for sort of beef systems now we are getting animal performance levels equivalent to barley and concentrates.
Now, we've said, and I know I've said on this programme before when we've talked about other methods of conserving cereal crops, one of the things that a lot of people probably don't realise is that the husk on the grain has to be broken before the animal can actually digest it. And if you allow this crop now to go almost to maturity, to combining stage, then that has to be taken care of. How is that done?
When machines were developed for cracking maize, which the same principles are involved, what we actually did about 6 years ago was work with Class, the German machinery manufacturers, to develop a set of twin rollers which are moving at sort of differential speeds. And the fact that they are moving at differential speeds means that they don't actually roll the grain, they actually sort of shatter it as the top roller passes the bottom one at a higher speed, and no grain can actually go through that machine without being damaged.
And have you found that that's effective? Have you found that all grains are actually rendered digestible?
Around about 3 years ago now, this question was raised over in England quite regularly, and with the help of the Milk Development Council, we set up a trial to prove the efficacy of the sort of grain processor. The results of that work, done at Harper Adams University College, came out with the untreated grain with a percentage digestibility of about 82, and the treated grain with a digestibility of 97. And that was traced right through the animal with chromium oxide markers.
Which is, I suppose that was almost an unfair question to you really, because even in the old traditional method of combining, storing dry, rolling and feeding it to it or crushing, if I at home had got 97% digestibility, I would be absolutely delighted. Yes. Because my guess is that in many of our systems we don't get anything near that.
That's probably true. I think the other factor is that it's well documented that ammonia, which we're using as the sort of preserving agent, does have an effect which increases the digestibility of the straw fraction of the crop. And the other thing is that because we're harvesting it with a forage harvester, probably 1/2 ton an acre of chaff is actually included in the product, and chaff has a digestibility of 80 on its own. In the olden times, none of the sort of threshing machines, the chaff was never thrown away, and yet if you follow a combine today, the floor is white with all the chaff on the floor. Now when it's done with a forage harvester, the farm gets all the material, so probably another 1/2 ton an acre yield.
But it's not going to be as simple as that. We've got to do something else, haven't we? It's not just a case of chop it and put it in a clamp like we did with early silage. What do we have to add to it?
Well, the pellet which I developed around about 10 or 12 years ago actually immediately gets into the clamp, releases ammonia. That ammonia and carbon dioxide destroy any moles and sort of bacteria, so we've got a perfectly stable crop, and that is one of the sort of major benefits of the system, that we can actually sort of cut the crops in damp conditions with no drying sort of problems, but the crop will remain completely stable through summer and winter alike.
What about the face of the crop and secondary fermentation?
Absolutely none at all. Because there is no fermentation. It never fermented in the first place. It was conserved with the ammonia, and the preservative that actually conserved the crop is ammonium bicarbonate, which is a combination of the ammonia released, the carbon dioxide released, recombining with more moisture to form ammonium bicarbonate. And the only thing that would destabilise the clamp would be any significant amount of ingress of water. But in normal conditions, no deterioration whatsoever.
Can I go back to you now, Keith, and just pick up a bit from you on the practical side of this now? Now, say for example, now I've grown this field of cereal, and I've asked you to come in now what would happen then? How quickly, for example, I mean, self-propelled foragers move at a frightening rate, don't they, as far as somebody with a buck rake or looking after the clamp is concerned?
Yes, they do. But with any silage system, I always say the man on the pit is the most critical. You can lose a trailer with a puncture. You can even if the forager stops. But if your man on the pit can't handle it, then that is the one job that holds it up.
How critical is it in siling this material then, this chopped whole crop, as compared to the care in siling grass? Is it easier or harder or about the same?
It's easier, I would say. For one thing, you'll have more time because you don't have quite the same yield off alkylage as you do off grass silage. So therefore, you've got to travel further to fill a trailer. So then it's longer going back at the pit. It's an easily moved product. It's easily pushed around the pit. It's easier. Yeah.
What about the additive that Alan says that we need to add to it? How is that added?
It depends. If you've got a big enough pit, it's normally put in a fertiliser spinner. And what you would do is you buck rake in maybe a foot. You don't want to build it in and come out. You want to build it in layers, and you put a layer in of about a foot deep, and then you just go over with a fertiliser spinner, just on tick over, and just spread it on. Or if your pit is smaller or whatever, then you tip the trailer, level it out, and put the additive on top.
The only thing you have to ensure, I suppose, is that the additive is mixed regularly through the clamp.
Yeah.
And then covering it, Keith, is it exactly the same?
It's exactly the same. Plastic sheet and tyres, or you could actually put a grass silage on top.
What about the dreaded aspect today of silage making, the effluent that might run out of it?
There's none at all. There's no effluent at all.
None at all?
No, none at all. There's no fermentation takes place, so therefore there's no effluent.
That surely must be one of the biggest attractions of this particular method, isn't it?
I would think so. Yes.
Because I think all of us dread silage time and a blocked drain or something that means that effluent would run somewhere where it shouldn't, which is absolutely critical these days environmentally.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Yeah, but there's nothing comes out of this. That's all.
And when you take it out, then now we've done a bit of whole crop last year. One of the things that we found was the actual chop, the material. It was hard to maintain a face on the silage clamp with a shear grab.
Right.
The face tend to keep collapsing out into the weather or whatever. How does alkylage stand up to that?
From what I've seen, it stands up pretty well. The people that done it last year, every single one of them has got a different feeding system, so it's difficult to say how it actually, how you get the finish on the face, and every tractor driver is different as well. So,
Now, in your experience, and you've been doing this now for some time. Is it most attractive to a dairy farmer or to a beef farmer, or is there any difference?
I don't think there's any difference at all.
What's happening on the island? Who's using it the most? Without names, just what sort of...
I would say it's 50-50.
Right.
50% of dairy and 50% of beef, yes.
Right. And the people that you're contracted to seem to be quite happy with it and prepared to do it again.
Well, nobody's come on the phone shouting and ranting and raving as to
and they would.
And they would. No doubt they would. It's with regards to what you said, it is not actually a whole crop as such. It's not a fermented material.
Right.
It's the next stage on sort of thing. It is a dry stable material.
Right. And the other thing, of course, that we all have, I mean, if you've got acidic silage, you tend to get some very, very definite slurry problems as well. This, and maybe I'd better go back to Alan with this, with a wider experience. What's the cow think of it, Alan, in your experience?
Cattle will always, in preference, eat alkylage in preference to silage. But quite a lot of units in England would self-feed alkylage and silage together. And the cows seem to
Well,
sort
this
of...
is a point. Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah.
You're not offering this as an alternative to grass silage. You seem to be offering it as being complementary to grass silage.
It is not an alternative. Well, it is an alternative, but it's not going to sort of change sort of silage making practice and so forth. It is a way of utilising a product which is different in the fact that it is alkaline to start with, so it balances the acidity of grass silage. It has a very high starch level, and we can actually cut higher up the stem to increase the density, so we can have a very high energy density rumen feeding stuffs, which has never been able to be achieved before. I mean, the only way we could make grass silage more sort of energy dense was by cutting it younger. And that took away the structural fibre that these high yielding animals or high performance animals require. We must be able to sort of get that structural fibre to keep them healthy.
Would this ever take the place of traditional harvesting, of combining, storing grain and rolling it and feeding it as dry grain?
I think it's a huge opportunity. Now that the sort of machinery side has been sort of solved, it's a huge opportunity now to sort of utilise grain crops as pretty well a concentrate part of the ration, but also carrying with it the structural fibre part of the diet that we really want to sort of support those animals with.
This is part of this sort of dramatic change that farming is going through, isn't it now? There are changes in many aspects of farming. The whole system is changing. But if we're talking about replacing what we've known as the harvest with combining or saving grain dry and in critical harvest weather, it seems to me, and not just you saying it, but my own observations suggest that we are beginning to move away from that very laborious, risky method of conserving grain.
Yeah. If we're doing it for animal feed, that is absolutely true. Obviously, I mean, we will still need combines to harvest grain for sort of wheat flour production and so forth.
Yeah.
But if we are feeding a ruminant animal needs this structural fibre. And if we separate the grains from the straw, as we do in a combine, why do we do it? Why do we separate the grains from the straw in a combine and then have to sort of roll grind, caustic treat, urea treat or whatever to the grain, and then go and spend time chopping the straw to feed it back to the cattle again when Keith's machine in one pass can actually do the whole job?
Well, the answer to your question, Alan, you asked the rhetorical question, why do we do it? But the answer is we didn't have the means or the facility, did we?
Exactly.
And we didn't have the scientific knowledge. We didn't explore a cow's rumen in years gone by to understand what was going on in there. And now all this is available to us. And it's opening up a whole new future in line with the changes that are taking place in agriculture.
One of the sort of key sort of pressures, as we all are aware, or all are aware, are the financial pressures. And the farming industry is effectively attempting all the time to convert the forages and the crops that we can grow out there into things that we can actually sell in milk, meat and so forth. And to some extent, this is giving an opportunity to sort of compete with the rest of the world in doing that job and providing those sort of products at a sort of a more realistic sort of price structure.
Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. We've come to the end of our time. It's quite interesting. This programme sometimes, quite often in fact, looks back in retrospect and looks over the days of farming in an age gone by, the sort of the romantic age of farming. We must remind ourselves, though, that there is a future, and we have to believe there is a future. And it's people like Alan Sayle and Keith Masson who bring these new processes to us that will secure that future. Change it may be, but we have to be prepared for it. Keith, thank you very much for joining me. Alan Sayle, thank you for spending some of your time that you're here on the island with us to share these new thoughts and bringing Manx agriculture into the 21st century. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. That's all we have time for this week. And this is John Kennaugh signing off until next week's programme.